Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Research Insights event this afternoon. It's about bordering, citizenship and migration after Brexit, and I'm really delighted to have research teams from two of the second phase Governance After Brexit programme projects. One project, the first we're going to hear from today, is called Rebordering Britain and Britons After Brexit. And we're going to be hearing from the team made up of Professors Nando Sigona, Professor Mikola Benson, and from Catherine Craven and Elena Zambella. The second project is on algorithmic politics after Brexit, looking at the algorithmic justice in the context of the EUSS scheme. And on that project, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sam Kingsley and Dr. Kuba Jablowski. We're using Slido today for questions. So as you go through the presentation, if you want to ask questions on the Slido system, that would be fantastic. You can also vote for questions that you think are particularly important. And at the end of today's event, we'd also ask you to complete the survey that we have on Slido. So without any further ado, I want to hand over to our first presentation.
Right, hi there, I'm Mikola Benson, and with the rest of the team, we're going to be presenting our latest work from the project, which focuses on a paper that we've written that explores the various ways in which that relationship between Brexit and migration has been written about. And we're specifically focusing on papers that have been written in migration studies journals. Now, this is a really broad interdisciplinary field. And we thought by looking at this, we might be able to give a flavour of the broad themes through which this is being explored. So in terms of the presentation today, we are going to be thinking about generally what knowledge is and isn't being produced in this body of work and why this matters. And broadly, what we could say is that this is a paper that tries to identify the spotlights, so those sharp focuses, those really intense focuses within that body of work, but also the blind spots in that migration scholarship on Brexit and migration nexus. So from our point of view as a research team, we're very keen to locate that analysis in broader debates on Brexit, but also thinking about those wider geographies, so thinking about the EU more generally and global political economy, while being attentive to the new formation of the British state, this idea of global Britain, its new formation outside of the EU, and the shifting politics of immigration within that structure. And we're going to conclude by suggesting some future lines of research in the field. So I'm going to hand over to Eleanor to explain a little bit about our methodology and the corpus.
Yes, so thank you, Mikola. So the objective of our review was to analyze sources that were published since May 2015, which is when the EU referendum was announced in the Queen's speech, until November 2021, which is when we started writing the paper. We proceeded in 3 steps. So we first created the overall database by querying Scopus and the Web of Science, and we used different terms, combining them, combining Brexit, migration, and citizen. And we narrowed our results to sources published in English or including at least an abstract in English. And then we merged the results obtained and deleted duplicates, ending up with a total number of 1,337 sources. We next proceeded with coding, and we identified for each of the source what type of source was that, which was the country of affiliation of the corresponding author, the object of study, and specifically the country and the populations, methodology, unit of analysis, and the keywords. And in the last instance, we filtered the sources that would go and constitute the corpus of our review paper by selecting, first of all, sources that were published in English language peer-reviewed migration journals, and also migration journals publishing in English. And second, from this subset, we selected only research articles and special issue introductions, which gave us a total of 61 sources. Michela, thank you. So migration journals, among the 61 articles that we obtained through this exercise, we saw that there were published over 13 journals, but 2/3 of them concentrate only in 3: the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and the Central and Eastern European Migration Review. Over 60% of the articles have a UK-based scholar as a corresponding author, and a third is authored by scholars affiliated with universities based in the EU27 or the EEA or Switzerland. And then there are 3 articles that are published by scholars affiliated with universities outside of the continental boundaries of Europe. The overwhelming majority of these articles focuses on the UK, either exclusively or in combination with an EU-EEA or non-EU-EEA country. Articles with a specific national or subnational focus concentrate on England, either alone or in combination with Scotland. The remaining 4 articles exclusively focus on the EU-EEA. Research was primarily undertaken in urban areas. For what concerns the migrant communities and the migrants investigated, 3/4 of the articles discuss the perceptions and experiences of nationals of EU member states in the UK. Among these, slightly less than 2/3 focus on citizens of Central and Eastern European countries, and Polish nationals feature the most. 6 articles discuss the experiences of EU14 nationals, either on their own or with nationals from the EU8. And among these, Italians featured as the most research group. Only a few focused on British citizens in the EU, either on their own or with another category of citizens of the EU in the UK. And some just focus on British citizens in the UK. Finally, there is an article that focuses on the experiences of EU returnees. Over to you.
One of the things we wanted to understand was if Brexit represented a shift in terms of some of the underlying discussion that has been held around migration studies, particularly emphasizing the role of methodological nationalism. That is the fact that a lot of migration research not only has its research question dictated or driven by policy agendas, but that it ends up to take the national borders as a natural container for the research. What is interesting, observing research that is focused on intra-EU mobility is the emergence over time of the EU as an actors within the governance of migration, particularly since the refugee crisis of 2015 and 16. We see the process of centralization of and harmonization of migration infrastructures at European level. And with this, we also saw the consolidation of a EU vocabulary of migration. What do we mean? As probably everyone knows, when we talk about intra-EU mobility up until Brexit, we always use the term EU citizen or mobile citizen, not the term immigrant, which is only applied to the third country national within the language of migration of the European Union. However, Brexit clearly creates a rupture in this language because, in a sense, well, we know that the EU nationals in Britain saw the citizens being rebordered as a result of the exit process from EU citizens to EU migrants and therefore immigrants, and similarly what happened with the British nationals. So what we observe is that the EU, in a sense, became also promoted a specific vocabulary of migration and the idea that a shift, in a sense, from what is the traditional methodological nationalism that has characterized a lot of migration research towards the fact of what we call a methodological supranationalism. in many ways, this language around migration that the EU has been promoting has been promoted through, for example, the EU research agenda on migration through a large amount of research funding that have been allocated around that, in a sense, have consolidated this vocabulary. Brexit, what we observe, has unsettled many of the assumptions that were underpinning this language. In particular, for example, the transformation from the point of view of the migrants themselves, the transformation from mobile citizen, EU citizen, into immigrants who need to be integrated. So it's not just the change of label, also imply a change in the sense of political agenda platforms. From the point of view of the change in migration governance, what we identify is this idea that it moved out to the UK from a series of EU-wide legal instruments, just for example, Dublin, to mention one, and has solidified the border between the EU and UK. With this process, it's also affected, for example, migrant routes and flows. We have seen, for example, the border crisis in the English Channel in the last few months. But what we think is really interesting to observe is also how Brexit has fractured what we call the epistemological field of migration studies, which had emerged over years across European comparative work and collaboration, and pan-European collaboration. In particular, it's also destabilized the position of some of the researchers who find themselves facing fundamental questions of both in terms of the concept that they use. We've seen, for example, a strong re-emergence of debate around integration, epistemologically about the definition of the subject of the research, but also methodologically and ethically.
So I guess the question is, what do we start to see then in the literature when we move towards Brexit? So this break. And I think that what's really, really apparent, or has been apparent to us, is that contra that shift towards methodological supranationalism, we've seen a very, very fast retrenchment of methodological nationalism within that body of work, with the result that Brexit is presented as a distinctly British problem, using all the kind of legal terminology, the policy language that you would get if you focused on, if you were looking at the using the UK migration policy regime as its point of reference, rather than that EU policy regime. We also see a kind of a real predominance of work focused on those living within the UK's borders, so those living within the UK's borders before Brexit. And I think that's really important. And you can see that in the relative balance, or imbalance rather, between the research that's been produced on British citizens in the EU and research that's focused on EU citizens in the UK. But at the moment, we're already in a position where we don't know, where there's no research, and it's probably a little bit too early to do this anyway, but there's no kind of consideration of actually the people who come after Brexit, or kind of like a leaning towards what might happen there. So there's a missing supranational scale there. And very, very quickly, that body of work has been rewritten as a British problem. And what happens here is that you lose reference to those broader migration politics within the EU, not just those questions around freedom of movement, but also Fortress Europe, the refugee crisis, questions about European disintegration. But beyond that, you also lose something around the conditionality of European Union freedom of movement. And kind of there's a framing very, very often when we look at this work to kind of look at inequalities within the EU citizen population, but to attribute those to nationality. So to talk about unequal Europes, hence that focus on the CEE as a point of reference. Whereas when we look beyond that, so the consideration of social location, so thinking about class, race, gender, and other aspects of social division, that's not really a strong feature within that body of work at the moment. So what we get is this understanding of cleavages within the EU population that is predominantly on the basis of their nationality. So once again, we see a kind of a different lens onto methodological nationalism, where the unit of analysis is the nationality, rather than considering how that might be fractured and structured. So you've kind of lost that original focus on EU citizens as a category of analysis, and then looking at the differences between them. The other thing that we want to point to is the kind of reframing of that population as a kind of a social problem. And you see in the work preceding work on Brexit that there were some populations within the EU citizenry who were considered through this lens when we talked about migration research. So it's not really that surprising that we see that kind of predominance of work on the CEE, because this is the population of EU citizens in the UK and actually elsewhere in Europe who had been the focus of what we could call a kind of a more migration-oriented lens towards understanding intra-EU mobility, whereas those kind of older EU citizens from those longer-term member states very rarely featured in that literature at all, particularly within migration studies. So I think that that's really a centrally important point, which is that we see that kind of continuation of a spotlight on the so-called problem EU citizens and the challenges those present to nation states, continuing into this body of work. But I think it's also noticeable when we look at this as a whole that Brexit is being presented as some way as exceptional, even within the context of the wider migration and citizenship landscape in the UK. So it's detached from those broader questions of migration, citizenship, and belonging. Notably, there doesn't seem to be a point of reference that brings it into conversation with research that has looked at racially minoritized Britons and their experiences of discrimination and disenfranchisement, or that brings it into line with research on foreign-born, and that is non-EU, EEA populations. So you really do get a sense through this literature then of an almost European exceptionalism in terms of this, or rather that Europeans are somehow exceptional within that migration context. So in conclusion, we're kind of just presenting a set of questions that we still think that we need some answers to. We think that actually this body of work needs to move on, and it needs to move on in some quite fundamental ways. We think that it's important to kind of bring together some of those lines of inquiries. So bring the research on Brexit and what this has meant for these directly impacted communities into a broader conversation around ongoing changes to the UK's migration and citizenship regime, but also recognizing how these sit in a longer history. So how does Brexit and the emergence of global Britain sit within that longer and connected history of migration and citizenship? And how might that shift our understandings of migration and Brexit? And here, very explicitly, we want to try and draw a line between that process of decolonization, for example, and this process through which Britain has de-Europeanized in some respects. But we're also very keen to highlight that there might be a tendency to kind of look just at what's happening in Britain without remembering how those changes to the British migration state are also drawn through its international and foreign relations. So thinking about that may also be an element that's of critical importance. So how does it interplay, for example, with ongoing processes within the EU? How does this shape of this new global Britain articulate with the kind of broader conversations around the global political economy of migration at the moment? And also how is it framed by these new trade deals, these new international relations that are being redrawn at this point of time? So really this was a starting point to kind of invite you into thinking with us about the broader framework within which we might work for understanding what's happening to Britain through looking at the case of what Brexit has meant for migration of these populations. So here is our paper on this. Please do take a look. and watch this space for more.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm intrigued by the by the argument that a lot of this research is driven by a policy agenda or responds to a policy agenda, and I'm wondering from the subsequent discussion how much of that is in this body of research, as it were, a UK policy agenda, and how much of it is an EU policy agenda, and I suppose then also, you know, thinking about how that sense of a kind of responsive, policy responsive research might be related to research that is grounded in something else, if you see what I mean. Whether there's a kind of basic research agenda that you see those other elements that you discussed in your conclusion as kind of grounding this kind of policy research. So UK, EU policy agendas. Yeah. Does anyone want to take that?
Shall I? I mean, one of the things that we wanted to highlight, in a sense, is that there is an ongoing debate within migration studies about this relationship between policy-driven, policy-informed, policy-relevant, like Oliver Bakewell has written about. So the quest for a migration study that doesn't take the framing from the policy discourse, and in a sense, what we wanted to highlight is that, and this debate has been in relation, in dialogue with another debate, which is the one around methodological nationalism. One of the points that we wanted to make is that it's the methodological nationalism has to be understood within the political economy of migration, in which research is also part of. And so we wanted to highlight the extent to which the fact that we were not allowed to talk of EU migrants as migrants, but like as citizens. It's something that became also embedded in research. As it became embedded in research, the countries with which we have been doing comparative work, because if you read any call for papers from Horizon, for example, the FP7, very much the framing of the research on migration, which has received a large chunk of funding, has been very much dictated by somehow embedded a EU perspective on it. What we were trying to explore here, and we did also a lot of the collaboration, the way we frame comparison, the country we compared with, but also the circulation of researchers. So there is also this element of the production of knowledge, let's say. And what we were trying to see is to what extent and in what ways Brexit has challenged, has posed question on multiple levels in terms of on understanding migration, understanding the governance, but also in understanding how we framed these questions.
That's fascinating, and the idea of methodological supranationalism as imposing its own set of kind of categories and concepts and so on is a very interesting one. I'm also interested in the way that kind of within state migrations get kind of forgotten and lost in both the kind of methodological nationalist and supranationalist framing. Does anyone else want to come in on?
Yeah, I was going to come in just on a slightly different angle onto this as well, Dan. I think very much the shape of that emerging field of research is following the kind of UK-led policy agenda, or speaks to that, which is, you know, it's completely understandable. But I think that the tendency within that is then to kind of overlook how that changing UK migration policy agenda is related to, well, it's not related to, has its mirrors in some of the changes that are happening in the EU as well, and of course at other scales. And I think that can tend towards that kind of exceptionality of the British migration regime, rather than looking at what the, you know, how those are, you know, how they trace similar lines or different lines, how they're similar and dissimilar in some respects. Not that it would just have to be UK EU either, because of course there are all sorts of broader international changes that are going on to global policy around migration. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think that sometimes we just kind of focus in on one place and these things that are changing. And certainly when you're talking with British citizens in the EU, you do get a sense that, you know, it's all the UK making all of these changes, and that it's not comparable to what's happening in the EU, when actually, when we look at some of the things that have been happening over the last few years at that bigger level, not necessarily with freedom of movement, you start to see a little bit more alignment than disalignment, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I do think there's a more general issue about how, as academics, we've got drawn into what was an enormously sort of fevered set of discussions and debates, public debates, you know, in academics, or in an interesting relationship to those, and getting drawn into lots of very kind of fast-paced, kind of responsive research, and maybe losing sight of the slower-paced, more grounded research that, you know, in one sense, can, even if you're looking at it from a sort of policy or policy relevant perspective, it can come back into its own. You know, we don't predict the things that will be rising to the top of a policy agenda particularly easily. So, you know, you find, you know, I don't know, to take a very obvious example, people who know a lot about Ukraine are probably getting a lot more airtime these days than they would have done a little while ago. Does anyone else want to come in? Or shall we move on to our next presentation? Sam, Kuba, do you want to share your screen?
Oh yeah, just give me a moment. And right. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
And you can hear me okay, I presume. Okay, I'll start then. So it's interesting because Michaela just said about how the EU population in the UK became a problem. What this paper is trying to do is to take the solution to this problem under a magnifying glass. So we'll talk about the digital bordering and transactional status in the European Union settlement scheme. I just wanted to acknowledge that this research, will be saying things about its methodology as we go along, but it's an engaged design, and we collaborate with the 3 Million, which is a civil society organization for EU citizens in the UK, and the Public Law Project, which is a public law charity, in conducting that research. So I really wanted to acknowledge them when I start. And what this paper is doing, it's slightly provocatively argues that under the EU settlement scheme, your immigration status is not really yours. We think that the case of the USS illustrates a certain shift from a fundamental status to relational status, which is dispersed across multiple databases and records, which are then navigated by automated systems every time the person granted status has to conduct a status checking transaction to evidence the rights to be in the UK. We're not saying that the status therefore doesn't exist, but we say that the status is not accessible to status holders outside of that status checking transaction. Because this system is prone to glitching, we use glitch as a sort of an entry point to understand and show how this system works. The notion of digital bordering and dynamics of bordering in general are really pivotal here. So before we crack on talking about what the USS is and how it works exactly, I'll just quickly hand over to Sam so he can say a few words about the dynamics of bordering in the first place.
Thanks, Kuba. So we begin from a position of thinking through bordering as an ongoing process, not necessarily a settled state of affairs, but borders as always being done. As Etienne Balabar was kind of suggesting, there are all sorts of ways in which borders are dynamic. There's a kind of topographical process of the relocating of borders from the outline of a particular kind of territory to the inside and the outside of that territory. So the sense in which actually there is a blurring of those lines that get drawn, that waver, and that can be an ongoing renegotiation of those lines and how they get drawn and how they get practiced. Where the border gets done becomes an intimate concern. A key topic of inquiry for a number of different scholars, but we're going to draw in particular on Louisa Moore's work here, is the way in which that negotiation of where bordering gets done has been relatively kind of turned into a kind of technological concern, and that has had a number of implications. So the technological process of rescaling borders from these kinds of outlines of particular kinds of territories to the doing of the border at particular moments in particular places positions the border within the kind of representation of the body of a particular kind of subject, the subject who wants to move across a border or wants to have particular kinds of status, which we're going to return to, in relation to those processes of bordering. So in lots of ways then, the border in and of itself of a particular political territory becomes located within the bodies or the representations of bodies in code, in particular forms of information, in relation to the kind of embodied kind of representation of that subject. Could we move to the next slide, please? One of the key things that this then does is it reconfigures a sense of status. So there are ways in which then the digitalization of these kinds of processes has had an intimate kind of impact and influence on the ways in which the European Union settlement scheme has been configured to function. So on the one hand, we can think of the European Union settlement scheme as a way of regularizing a particular population. There was a population who lived in the United Kingdom without any kinds of issues akin to these. And then Brexit presents a moment when those people suddenly are actually a migrant population. They are rendered migrants rather than being kind of fellow European citizens. So there's a regularization process that is happening, and particular kinds of status then need to be attributed to those people, need to be calculated about those people. Another really interesting issue that then arises around the digital bordering process in relation to this status is that it actually reconfigures, we argue it reconfigures the nature of that status and the nature of the rights that might be associated with that status. So on the one hand, whereas the kinds of status that we might have associated with being a European citizen who has particular kinds of rights to freedom of movement, for example, was a kind of declaratory sort of system. You had rights that you simply needed to kind of invoke, and that these were declared, to what we are calling a transactional status, which is always being done and redone. It happens in the moment of that status being checked. So rather than it being a check of a status that has an underlying reality, a fixed reality that exists, actually within the EUSS, that kind of calculation of whether you are entitled to that status happens each and every time that status is checked. And therefore we kind of consider this as a transactional status throughout this paper. And I'm going to hand back to Kuba to flesh this out.
So here is how the digital bordering in the EUSS works. I assume that there is probably a certain level of knowledge in people watching about the scheme, but just to recap where it came from, it obviously was designed in parallel with the withdrawal negotiations. The UK government quite early on stated that this new system for EU citizens who were exercising free movement rights, but then suddenly had to regularize after Brexit, would be digital. Already in June 2017, in the Furman series offer on citizens' rights, Prime Minister Theresa May said it would be a streamlined digital process. Those proposals were fleshed out a year later in June 2018 with the EUSS Statement of Intent, where more details was provided about how the not only how the application system will work, which was the sort of initial proposal, but also how the status check will work. And the Statement of Intent for the first time said the status under EUSS would be digital and that no physical document will be issued to status holders. And the final text of the withdrawal agreement, it contains a provision for that in Article 18.1 and 18.4, which say that the applicants have the right to a residence document, which may be in a digital form. And what it meant in practice was that the application process was digital by default. So it is possible, and it was possible, to make an application to the EU settlement scheme outside of the digital system, but the default pathway led through this app, which is pictured here, the EU Exit ID document check app, and that led to 3 types of automated checks being conducted on applicants. So you would use the phone to scan your ID document if it had a chip in it, and then you would use it to scan your face in order to provide that you're the person applying. Then you'd input certain kinds of data, and the system would conduct 2 further types of checks, so-called suitability checks. So the system would search your details against criminal and security databases in order to assess suitability for the scheme, and then the eligibility check, which was the sort of the one that generated the most attention, I suppose, in people who were following those developments, which was the check that searched the details entered against the government-held records, namely the tax and welfare records, to establish a trail of residence, because the system would grant settled status or permanent, more or less, status to those who have been in the UK for 5 years or more, and then pre-settled status to those who were not, but who arrived in the UK before the end of the transition period, before the end of December 2020. The COVID pandemic means that the year disappeared, but yeah, I think it was December 2020 anyway. So this is how the status checking would work, and then, or the determination of status would work. And then the proof of status takes that even a step further. This status is digital only, so you can only prove it going to the government website, logging in and generating something that is called a share code, and then the status checker. And the status checker can be a representative of the state, but also somebody conducting the sort of the delegated immigration authority, so a landlord, an employer, hiring, letting out a house, and so on and so forth, as part of the so-called hostile environment. So this is how the system works, and there is no offline or non-digital equivalent or alternative to the way the status checks. And here is the really interesting thing. So you'd think that it is all digital, so at every point or at any point, the Home Office should know how many people applied to the scheme. And this is where it started getting interesting, because this number was first queried in October 2019. There were numerous requests to the Home Office to say how many people actually applied. And it turned out that the Home Office is able to count applications, so the transactions with the EU settlement scheme, but it wasn't able to provide the number of applicants. who either applied or were granted status under the scheme. It took until April 2021, so a year and a half, to produce first reliable estimates of how many people were actually in the system as opposed to how many transactions it conducted. And then in September 2021, the Home Office finally explained why it was such a problem. And I'll read out the explanation. It says, the explanation said, there are several caseworking systems used to administer applications to the scheme, each with a unique application number, but not a single person identifier to distinguish repeat applicants. Analysis using probabilistic data matching methods have been developed to better understand the number of repeat applications to the scheme. And this slide, the table here represents that. There is no unique identifier enabling us to trace a data subject, so the person conducting those transactions within the USS. There are methods, obviously, to establish that, as the Home Office explains, but there is no single number that the person would have allocated. The system works off the email address, which is unique, but it's not stable. Email addresses change. Document number, again, unique, but not stable. Every 10 years, actually, you have a new document issued. Family name, which is neither unique nor stable. And then date of birth, which obviously is stable, but it is not unique. And that led us to a couple of conclusions. First of all, we were wondering how well does it tally with numerous recommendations about the Home Office data practices, for example, from the Independent Chief Inspector for Borders of Immigration, or from the Windrush Lessons Learned report, which both pick up on poor record keeping by the Home Office. But more importantly, we're wondering what it means to status and what it means to status display if every time you want to prove your status, you have to, or the Home Office has to effectively generate it from those records that it has. And to engage with that, we use that notion of glitch that Sam will now talk about for a bit.
Thank you, Kuba. So as Kuba has just explained, there are a number of ways in which there are issues around that have to be negotiated within the processing of people's applications and the processing of the ways in which these status queries are resolved. And we have found a useful way of thinking about this is through this conceptualization of the glitch, in part because glitch occurs in the kind of ordinary language that gets used to describe how people experience, albeit in the minority of cases, but how some people do experience the process of proving their status. So in this sense, then, a glitch, as you can see in this slide, is regarded as an unpredictable cause and effect, and it's a marginal occurrence, but, and we're going to move on, there are a number of kind of characteristics around glitching which make it a useful lens for thinking about the EUSS in particular. So glitches provide us with a kind of insight into the ways in which particular kinds of experimental modes of the production of knowledge or particular kinds of processes in the world get done. So as many of you will be no doubt familiar, computer code is not visible. We see the outputs and occasionally see the inputs, as is the case with the EUSS. But what happens in between those steps is kind of a mystery. It's a black box. And so the ways in which we can kind of begin to understand how that functions might come from the exceptions that that take place. So the errors, the glitches, the mistakes. And so glitches become this kind of useful heuristic for thinking about what kinds of processes are happening in that kind of black box environment. And they become a useful heuristic for those people who want to ask questions about how a particular function performs. Likewise, as Schneider suggests, what it does is it kind of sets precedents. There are ways in which the doing of these checks. So if we're engaged in a status check, either as a landlord or as somebody trying to prove that we have the correct status, there is a precedent being set every time we're kind of performing this kind of action. And most of the time there is a kind of correct operation. There is a kind of normal agreeable way of resolving this kind of proof. And yet occasionally there are not, and there is a kind of disagreement. So somebody is absolutely certain that they can and should have the correct status, and yet the system is not proving that for them in a way in which they had expected. Is an unexpected kind of outcome from the operation, this glitch, as we might understand it. But in many senses, it's precisely those glitches that actually retrospectively define what a correct operation can and should be. So there's a sense within which the exceptions begin to begin to outline the edges of what correctness might be in these circumstances. Because what happens as a result is there has to be a form of negotiation for, so how, given that I think I do have this status, how is it that I now am able to prove this? How is it that I can go about negotiating, rechecking? Now, in some cases, it may just be that you do the check again and the second time or the third time it works. In others, there might be other kinds of recourse, and we can talk about those further in the Q&A potentially. There is also a sense in which actually, and before I move on to this slide, I'm just going to briefly cover what Louisa Moore said more recently, which is there is a sense in which actually all of these things then kind of reveal the form of reason that algorithms embody, if you like, the ways in which particular kinds of decision-making processes at policy level, at an engineering level, all sorts of steps along the way of producing a particular digitized process like the EUSS, how those forms of reason become encoded. Because there are all sorts of mundane decisions that are taking place throughout the development of this process and its maintenance, in fact, that are particular kinds of steps that have particular forms of bearing upon how this proof of status can and should function. So there is this real sense in which actually all of these small ongoing forms of decision making come together and are kind of metastasized within the code to produce a particular form of reason that can have then unexpected effects. If we could move on again, thanks, Kuba. So in this sense, we can think about, with Lashinsky and Elwood in an excellent recent paper in Big Data and Society, which is on a completely different topic, but their conceptualization of glitching is really helpful here. We can think about how glitches actually might be considered a kind of systemic design feature of digital systems. There is a very real sense in which users are actively involved in testing how any kind of digital system functions. You hear a kind of glib reference to things like permanent beta mode and so on amongst particular startups or even more established companies that are trying to sell us apps and so on. And that might matter to a certain degree to certain people. But when it comes down to something as fundamental as our kind of political status, where we are able to live and the kinds of things that we are granted access to doing, it perhaps takes on a different kind of register and a different set of importances, different set of political considerations. So there is a very real sense in which actually these features that glitches embody are kind of generative fissures that produce politics in and of themselves. Politics get done within these exceptions, as much as they get done within the kind of the negotiations that happened throughout the development of the withdrawal agreement and the ways in which kind of everyday politics is ensuing since. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the sense in which, or rather Kuba is going to briefly talk about the sense in which this actually might play out. Sorry.
So what Sam said is very clearly visible in the practice of how USS status checking works. And when we conducting our research, we saw two particular types of repeat application glitches that hinted at this incorrect operation of the system that was indicative of its transactional design. So you put in multiple applications to the USS. In many cases, for example, you may have an application refused. A remedy to that recommended by the Home Office is just apply again for as long as you're within the application deadline. The scheme grants pre-settled status to those who don't have 5 years of continuous residence in the UK, which is another reason for repeat application. So you may have pre-settled status under the scheme, but if you want to have permanent rights to stay in the UK, you have to apply under the scheme again, conduct another transaction with the system. Or, for example, you may have been previously refused. You think you still have a good case. You apply again to fix that. And what numerous civil society organizations supporting USS and users reported is that when conducting the status check, they can lose access to existing status on repeat applications. So the status, the pre-settled status they have, for example, disappears. Instead, they see a pending application or evidence of pending application. Or people who had a refused application and would like to see that pending application, because pending application under USS grants you the rights, they only see their previous refusal. The 3 Million queried this with Immigration Minister Kevin Foster in October 2021, and the response was interesting and it's worth citing in full, although we're pushing the time limit. Minister Kevin Foster said, this issue was caused by the logic by which status services react to caseworker events, such as applications or grants of status. When the problem was occurring, it was because our services logic was to override old status with a new one, because we believed this would be the most relevant one to display. We have changed the logic in November 2021 in response to feedback. So a person with pre-settled status continues to see their status when they make a fresh application. The trouble with that response is that follow-on inquiries that we made through Settled, which is another organization working with the USS applicants and status holders, and with the 3 Million, indicate that this, for some users, this problem persists. There is another problem relating to route switching glitches, and we're a bit out of time to elaborate on this, but it's important to know that people who had existing status granted under other immigration routes than USS may lose access to those statuses if they apply under the USS. So where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us with this transactional design of the USS. The person in the middle has made repeated applications. First, they applied with an ID document, but they knew this ID document would be changing, so they decided to withdraw that application, submit another application, which got pre-settled outcome, and then they decided with a new ID document, and then they decided with that new ID document to apply again for settled status. But the third application had an error. They were still before the deadline. So instead of fixing that application, they just left it in the system and applied again to get settled status. This fourth application got decided first. The third application then got refused, because if you don't refuse with your application, it will get refused by the Home Office. They're left with this myriad of record, and their situation is quite straightforward. They're vulnerable and applicants under the USS. This is a straightforward application, and it's still a bit of a mess of records, which every time the status check is conducted, the automated system has to navigate to determine what to display. And as the Home Office admitted, sometimes the system does get it wrong. So in conclusion, we argue that this shows this shift from a fundamental status to relational status, and we can have a debate about how much of a shift this actually is. But the two main points are that this status under the USS is dispersed across multiple records and databases. But despite it is dispersed, the system overall is centralized. It's guarded by that one entry point through which you have to engage in order to display your status. And we also agree that the status therefore is generated by an automated system for each status check based on records traced during this check. So it doesn't really exist in that sense. It's generated each time status check is conducted. So all the ingredients exist on Home Office databases, but they remain inaccessible to holders outside of the status checking transactions. We had a few questions that we wanted to pose at the end, but I think Dan is ready to wrap this up and start asking questions himself. So I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was fascinating, really rich stuff. Early on in your presentation, you talked about Theresa May describing the system, or the aspiration for a system of streamlined digital status, but the system as it's grown up feels like it's anything but streamlined. Do you think it would have been possible to create a streamlined system? So is this a set of political choices, or is this more inherent in the design of this automated digital system?
Can I say a word about Streamlight, and then I'm sure Sam will have a more zooming out response. What we didn't say in the presentation is that it was in the notes but got cut out in the edit, is that in some senses this system is streamlined. The Home Office keeps claiming it is a success, and in some ways it's hard to disagree. So it processed around 6 million applications before the deadline. It issued over 5 million decisions. This is astonishing pace of decision making, especially given the Home Office's previous performance. I think the paper-based applications for permanent residence for EU citizens were counted in perhaps tens of thousands a year, definitely not millions a year. So in a sense, this is a very streamlined system. The glitching that we describe is also affecting, we actually don't know, because the Home Office could be better at monitoring it. But from all we know, it probably affects not a big majority, a sort of small minority of the status holders. But on the other hand, we know from research by organizations and reports by organizations supporting EU citizens that those who struggle with the system are disproportionately vulnerable. They have complex situations. So I guess this raises a question of what we call streamlined, and for whom it is streamlined and for whom it isn't. It certainly is streamlined for the status checker, and the status checker has full control over the records displayed. So administratively, it is working quite well, but for the users, it poses some serious questions, and especially this autonomy over status is a big question. But I'm sure Sam will have something as well to say to follow that up.
Yeah, I mean, I'd support absolutely everything that Kuba just very expertly kind of outlined. I think one of the things that perhaps underlies some of that claim is a kind of implicit recognition that the administrative systems of the United Kingdom government are dispersed, somewhat chaotic, perhaps, and that there aren't, as Kuba kind of has already outlined, even within relation to the EUSS, but in general, there are not many unique identifiers that would facilitate easily joining up all of these systems. Of course, we had a go at that under the Labour government in relation to the kind of prototypes for ID cards, but that met very, very stiff political opposition for all sorts of different kinds of reasons that I won't rehearse here. But actually there are not that many reliable unique identifiers that can pull these things together. So in that sense, given the kind of reality of administrative systems, the degree to which they work reliably digitally, because of course they all have, quite a lot of them have long non-digital legacies, I think we might kind of grant the UK government some license in making a claim that this is a relatively streamlined process, not without all sorts of difficulties, all sorts of political issues, but in the sense in which it actually functions, and as Kuba has already outlined, has processed rather a lot of people, there is a sense in which it can be reasonably claimed to be streamlined. I think one of the key issues that we are asking more broadly within the project is, so what does that streamlining mean? What comes as a result of that? What does that mean to what status is, and what actually is a status then, given all of the kinds of ambiguities that we've already outlined in this paper, and there are more? And what kinds of things does this tell us about the digitization of the state more broadly? Because if this is a success story and is kind of sold internally as a kind of example of a kind of digital by default process, administrative process that the government has successfully rolled out, what might that mean to kind of wider understandings of how these sorts of digitization processes happen at state level, at least within the United Kingdom government? So there's an awful lot that underlies that kind of claim, at least from our perspective and the perspective of the kinds of broader research questions we're asking.
Thanks. Perhaps we could invite the other research team to rejoin us. And I wonder, given your work on the field of migration studies, whether the shift to this digital system for processing and recording this new status of being a migrant, having been an EU citizen, does that come as a surprise, given from a kind of migration studies point of view, or does it gel with the sorts of themes on kind of changing status that you find in migration studies? Is that a fair question? I see slightly wry smiles. So,
can I just start? One thing I thought about at the end of the conversation was that a lot of the debate of Brexit and migration is not happening in Migration Studies Journal. I mean, if you look at the big numbers of articles we identified, that it was a tiny minority in Migration Journal, which is actually quite interesting, because I was thinking, that the paper that Sam and Kuba will present would be great to see it published, but somehow I suspect you're not going to go for a Migration Journal. Oh, no, that would be my guess. But there is an area of the debate in the migration scholarship that is somehow relevant here, and is all this debate around the migration infrastructures, and the extent to which migration infrastructure meant both in terms of physical, legal, but also technological structure are shaping and reshaping the migration flows, but also the rights of migrants and the everyday life of migrants. So there is that kind of literature that seems quite relevant there.
Just to add, I would just say in really quick reflection is that I think that is a really meaningful conversation to have, like an interdisciplinary conversation that could probably be had more broadly. There are people kind of making some really interesting contributions there, and I would highlight Louisa Moore's recent work and some of the work that's been done around how sort of big data and so on kind of relates to this stuff. And that's only from the perspective as a digital geographer. I'm sure I'm missing all sorts But I just wanted to kind of second that point.
It's an interesting question about, how we create the research spaces for these kinds of academic conversations as well. And it's one of the nice things about an interdisciplinary research program, that it can create a bit of space for bringing these sorts of conversations together, because they don't always have very obvious or natural kind of academic homes.
Can I just add a quick point, because it's in relation to the paper that that Mix and team presented. I was thinking how, on the one hand, you're talking about EU migrants or EU citizens, sorry, mobile EU citizens becoming migrants. But this exchange goes both ways, because one thing to be said about this UN-proof system and the general infrastructure that comes with it is that as of now, it has been rolled out to all migrants in the UK. So it's a system designed with EU citizens in mind, but now it serves everybody. And the more different types of immigration records you'll have under the system, the more of the kind of glitching that we talked about will probably occur. Although it is not about the glitching, actually, it is about how the system works when it's not glitching, and the lack of the autonomy of migrant over it. But there are multiple cases to link those mobile EU citizens and migration studies fields to really comment on how this landscape is changing.
I had just a quick question or a point. I find this really fascinating, Kuba and Sam, thank you so much. One thing I was thinking about as you were talking is, when does this digitalization of the state, who does it work for, and does it work in other non-migration related fields of the state? And if we can establish a little bit more of a baseline around that, and then identify that actually in the field of migration or in relation to migrants, there is something different here, I think that would be really interesting. More, I wonder if you have, any information on that.
Well, I can only say what I don't know, but there is the kind of digital ID system being tested for EU citizens, and it has quite huge differences with how the migration status works. It's not something I have looked into in details. But certainly our civil society partners have. They're often a little bit more on the ball than academics in the kind of response to the practical challenges that happen. But it's a very good question, a very good point. And the comparison between the system for migrants and non-migrants would show that they're actually configured. They seem to be configured at this time very differently.
I wonder whether there's also something about the issue of the kinds of status, decisions about status, and then proof of status relating to migration that have different kinds of political qualities to them to other decision making and administrative processes that have been digitized, not least within the United Kingdom government, but in governments more broadly across the world. That digital by default phrase that we used is rolled out by UK government and was kind of pioneered by a number of different bits of the civil service. It's certainly not peculiar to the British government. The Obama administration really championed a kind of digitization process and brought in some of the kind of leading lights from various bits of kind of technology development circles, and where they kind of touch with policy to kind of think about how they would roll out a more kind of digitized form of government. And I suppose it rather depends in the first instance on the kinds of politics that you have or want to apply to kind of judging the appropriateness of that because it has kind of it has divided opinion quite strongly in all sorts of different kinds of ways, I suppose. There are some really perhaps banal and less, or at least less obviously fraught areas of governance that that digitization has happened and kind of considered to be successful. Some of those have been in relation to tax, and some of them have been in relation to other forms of identity, but they're not necessarily about proving a kind of fundamental status. So some of the aspects to do with the renewal, I don't think it's the initial proof, but the renewal of driving licenses adopts a sort of similar model of forms of automation in the background, but it's really quite different sort of decision-making processes that are in train there. And actually the underlying status that you're talking about, like, do you have it being checked, and then just saying, yes, you do have it, is fundamentally different to the kinds of transactional status that we've already outlined. So in that sense, I suppose there is, at the moment, we would argue there is a uniqueness to some of these things. And again, like Kuba, I'm going to admit that, you know, my knowledge is entirely partial. So if anybody out there does want to kind of correct us or add more in and suggest other avenues of kind of consideration for wider research, then please do let us know.
Thanks. I've seen both Nando and Mikola's hands go up and down. Do either of you want to come in at this stage? Okay. We've had an anonymous question about whether it would have been feasible for the Home Office to have designed a system that did contain a unique person identifier in the time available. I guess one of, you know, another angle on that is without a unique personal identifier, would it be possible for users of the system to have a kind of stable documentation on which they could rely, which would see them across the kind of glitches and transactional nature, or is that an impossible dream?
Well, I guess it's a little bit complicated. In principle, probably yes, it would be possible. Although it kind of, from the outside, the USS looks like a system, but it actually isn't. Every component was developed by a different consortium with then, you know, well, we know only about one of the elements, but there were, you know, multiple systems actually being assembled together to produce the USS. So that probably would be one difficulty. When asked about the unique user identifier, somebody from the Home Office once told me that the reason that the system doesn't have it is because some of the software used as the main case working database didn't have the feature, and it was off-the-shelf software. So maybe there is something about, you know, the pressure of time that impacted the design of the system. But I think the important thing about the transactional nature of this status is that even with the unique user identifier with multiple transactions, the system still has to decide what is your immigration status right now, and that calculation happens automatically and on the spot. So that's still, maybe it's fine, maybe it isn't. You know, we don't make the claim that this is necessarily wrong, but we're merely saying that this is what happens, that in the check, the system has to look up your records without the user identifier. It may not find all your records, but even if it finds all your records, it then decides what system is, what status is appropriate for you at that time. Whether the Home Office, whether the users could be provided with something stable, well, a lot of people working in the space keep saying or repeating the word token, that it would be great if there was a token of status, but the Home Office is very reluctant to it and does not want to issue one. And it seems to me that the key sticking point is Another letter from the Home Office to the 3 million explains it very well. The 3 million made a proposal about such a token in the form of a QR code. The Home Office said the data must always be up to date, so any status check reflects the person's current status, and the current status is a key word. A token or the user's ability to select the status that they want to show would remove that functionality. The Home Office very clearly wants that functionality to be with them. And then in that letter, they elaborate how your immigration status can change. And the key facet, the key aspect of digital technology and digital status is to reflect all those changes. Usually in talking about those changes, the Home Office likes to talk about how your status can get better, how you can transfer from from temporary to permanent form of leave or whatever. But obviously we know that status can change also downwards or can be revoked, and digital check in this form without a user token, without offline access, guarantees that this status will always be up to date.
Thanks. Elena?
Yeah, so thank you, Kuba and Sam. And in fact, I wanted to ask you whether the concept of performativity might be useful in order to precisely to render this temporariness and precariousness that you're talking about more than transactionality, because transaction is more about it's more like neutral, if you want. It's more like a description of an exchange, whereas the performativity aspect of it is precisely the fact that it's assembled every time, and the outcome might be unknown and might vary unless it is performed over and over again.
I would only agree. I mean, that probably belies my kind of theoretical preferences, but yeah, I totally agree. I think there is a very real sense in which this, what we're currently calling a transactional status, is a performative function, and in some senses, the heuristic of the glitch provides you a way of revealing the performative aspects of what's taking place. So I think that's a really useful observation, and I think we definitely will think about how we're framing that that conceptualization. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks. I'll come to you, Nando, in a sec. I just want to bring up some of the questions from the Slido about the trying to link together the intentionally relational nature of the USS system with unintended consequences, but also thinking about how that's rolling out to the UK's developing kind of migration regime or immigration system. And I guess I'm interested in trying to connect that to the first presentation and the connection to the kind of global political economy of migration and how the UK's developing regime fits into that. But I'll hand over to Nando. I don't know if you want to take that or ask your question, or if anyone wants to jump in on that question. Nicola?
I can jump in. I mean, I think so. I think that okay, albeit not in the form that it's taken with the EUSS, but we knew that the Home Office were already testing digital modes of evaluating potential applications, and they were doing this through tier 5, sorry, which is the Youth Mobility Scheme, which is an element of the migration citizenship nexus that very few people look at. So there were already evaluations going on using kind of algorithms to determine whether people were eligible to come or not. As far as I'm aware, it's already been, a digital status has already been rolled out to the Hong Kongers, so people coming in through the Hong Kong BNO visa scheme. So you can see very much, I mean, what's fantastic about this paper is it really, really does show how EUSS is caught up in that migration policy landscape and all of the technological advancements that are being put to work there. So it's kind of been used as a kind of a test case. As so often is the case, you know, they looked for a solution to deal with the changing status of one population, And then, you know, as an added bonus, let's see how it rolls out more generally. So I think that's you can see that then. And of course, we've got all sorts of other kinds of ways of kind of pre-recognizing people digitally when we travel. So all of the kind of, you know, just basic travel information that gets collected on us all before we move, that's part of the global political economy of movement across borders, whether it's for the purposes of migration or not. So I think from that point of view, it's important to connect up those global conversations that are happening there. As both Sam and Kuba already identified, you know, there are other international precedents for this as well.
We have a question about relating to EUSS processes of digital bordering and broader questions about digital divides and access to services, legal advice, welfare benefits, healthcare advice, and so on by diverse local and regional communities in the UK, which I guess you know kind of picks up this question about other places in which the UK state is using these kinds of technologies and what the implications might be. We've also got a question about a difference between digitalized systems that have a backup token or paper system, whereas the View Improve service doesn't have it. So it's kind of digital only rather than digital by default in that sense. But this question about other digital divides.
Other digital divides than in immigration. I'm not sure if I understood the first question.
So it's is there a relationship between the EUSS process and broader questions of digital divide, access to quality services, and so on?
Oh yes, I mean definitely. One reason why we don't talk about it is because there is already a project within UK and Changing Europe that does talk about it quite extensively in terms of the accessing or the problems of access rather than what the status is. So I can only say absolutely yes. It multiplies those issues with access. And what's interesting, actually, the kind of the accessibility of those services. So the impact of the digital divide is the argument that quite often is being leveraged to deal with the substantive matter of what the status is. So the one challenge, legal challenge against the digital status that was in front of a court in the UK. There was a judicial review where the 3 million were a claimant and Public Law Project were representing them. And the grounds for that challenge was not how the status is configured, but rather how it's accessed, how it leaves out people with disabilities, how it accesses certain ethnic groups, which will have lower levels of literacy and digital literacy in particular, and some other groups. So it has huge equality impacts that are, we would argue, very hastily assessed, if at all, by the Home Office. And it seems that digitization is a thing that just happens. The government has all those deadlines, as Catherine said, to meet, and you know, there is that speed at which it has to be happening, and there is very little scrutiny when, you know, so yes, absolutely is the short answer. I'll shut up now.
Catherine?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that's also well, to relate it back to our project, this idea that post-Brexit, we might want to reassess how the population at large, settled or, you know, with migrant background, relates to the state. Might change, might not, but to open that up for, you know, empirical investigation, I think is really important. And this, you know, that some of the issues cross-cut across settled and migrant or newly migrant-made populations.
Nando?
There was something that was mentioned early on in the presentation, something about who owns the status. And I think there is so much around who owns this status. It's really important. And it's actually, in a way, almost linked the two projects very closely. I mean, this idea that with Brexit, you have a process of rescaling of citizenship or membership, redefining the Britain, the people that live in Britain, but also obviously the Brits abroad. And there is this idea that taking back control is embedded in the digital infrastructure. The status is confirmed at any specific moment in which you ask. You don't know if you're going to have it 5 minutes later. You know, this idea that you lose is a very sort of the power imbalance is embedded in the system. And this is also why a lot of the EU national always point out the fact that they would like to have a piece of paper to prove that they got the status for a period, which is what we are used to do with the passport. You know, the passport, you know, you have 12 years from now, and this one doesn't give it to you. So there is this element of connecting, you know, the politics of Brexit, take back control, to the digital infrastructure put in place, which I think will be really important to unpack, to continue to unpack, these conversations.
Sam, did you have your hand up?
Nando actually really kind of covered some of what I was kind of thinking anyway, so thank you very much.
Just a quick point to flip it back to the other team, because I was wondering to what extent you look at the specific regularization schemes. It's actually the kind of the idea that it is a regularization scheme comes from one of our interviewees who used to be a Home Office official. So to what extent are you looking at those those other schemes? Because we are so obsessed with the USS. I'd love to be able to see that in a comparative perspective, not least because whenever meeting British in Europe, a fantastic civil society group that I know that you've been working with for such a long time, they always say that, yes, it's horrible for you, not, and then say, oh, let us tell you how bad it is for us. And it always sounds even worse. So I really didn't want to forget them and just ask you how much you'll be looking to the nitty-gritty of what's happening to them administratively.
So obviously, Cuba, I spent about 4 years trying to keep on top of that. 27 nation states is a bit tricky when there's just one of you. But of course, I do know some of the things that have happened in particular cases. So I know very intimately what's been happening in France over a long period of time. But the difference is it's not a digital status. So I think that's, you know, it's really, really clear to me, particularly in that case, that it's not a digital status. So it's equivalent from the point of view of that it's a constitutive system, like it is in the UK for EUSS, but it's different because people were waiting for cards to turn up, essentially, for them to go and pick things up. And that created lots of problems. And then it's a question of what's contingent on those cards and being able to demonstrate them. But once they've got the card, they've got the card. So in that respect, it's a little bit different. And I'm not trying to downplay all the challenges that British citizens in France have had, that British citizens in Spain and Italy continue to have for a variety of reasons. But it doesn't have quite the same digital governance side of things that you've been dealing with there. So yeah.
One of the things we are doing though is it's that our sort of sample, the people we're working with, we are including both the old established EU nationals and the new EU nationals in Britain. So in the sense of saying how they engage with the different system, different sort of bureaucratic infrastructures is something that is going to emerge after we do the interviews that we're going to explore in terms of defining also the sense of belonging and how the infrastructures make you feel in terms of
Sam, did you have a question? No? So we're almost at the end of our time. Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. If I'd like to ask if there are any sort of final remarks anyone would like to make. If not, I'm just like to thank you for fascinating presentations and thank you also for setting out what seems to me to be a really rich interdisciplinary space for further discussions across the projects and more broadly. So, diolch yn fawr.
Okay, perfect.